I'm Rob Tracinski. This is Salon of the Refused, where we talk about ideas that are outside the mainstream. My guest today is Bob Garmong. He's a former lecturer at Dongbei University of Finance and Economics in China. But before he went to China, he got a PhD in philosophy and is something of an expert on John Stuart Mill, which is the reason I have him on here. Thanks for coming on, Bob.
Great to be here. Thank you. This is a topic that is near and dear to my heart, although I'm now out of academia and working as an immigration and education consultant here in China. John Stuart Mill is still still very close to my heart, not necessarily in a good way.
Well, that's what I want to go into, and this is the reason why I'm having you on for this part of the conversation. We're going to talk about China some other time, but one of my pet peeves, as you know, for a very long time, is the idea of conservatives accepting that the alternative to them, that the left, is the liberals, quote unquote liberals. And it raises a big question, which is, liberalism originally meant pro-freedom. That's the etymology of the word. There are still places in the world, in Australia, where the Liberal Party is the more pro-free market party. But there's this thing that's happened in America, especially, where liberal has come to mean the left, which in many ways is the most illiberal side of the conversation. So the question I have is, how is it that liberalism came to mean a philosophy that's anti-freedom? And from some of the things you've written recently and in the past, and from looking at it myself, I've come to realize that John Stuart Mill is really crucial to that process.
Yeah, and the left today is increasingly illiberal in the real meaning of that word, right? And you've written a great piece on that, and I generally agree with your take on John Stuart Mill. I have an article coming out shortly in an upcoming book on Ayn Rand's political theory called "The Arc of Liberalism," which traces the path from John Locke through John Stuart Mill and to Ayn Rand, in which I argue that really John Stuart Mill is basically public enemy number one for true liberty. Although he wrote a book famously called On Liberty, I argue that he had much to do with that conversion of so-called liberalism to what we regard as the liberals today.
Well, one detail that I don't know if you're probably familiar with this, but I discovered it recently. It was found it kind of delightful that the leftover remnant of the Liberal Party in Britain is the Lib Dems, the Liberal Democrats, and as a symbol of party leadership, the new leader of the Liberal Democrats is given an old, 150-year-old copy of John Stuart Mill's On Liberty. That's how important it was for the history of liberalism.
Right. And yet, my whole point, and the point of this forthcoming paper of mine, is that, in fact, it's a terrible, terrible misunderstanding. Although On Liberty has some wonderful rhetoric, and it sounds really beautiful in its defense of liberty, and particularly he's focused on what he regards as freedom of speech or intellectual freedom. In fact, I think he radically undermines that very freedom.
Well, I find it interesting that from my understanding, Mill, he was very strong on freedom of speech and also on sort of lifestyle freedom, freedom to engage in, we would think of sex, drugs, and rock and roll in the modern context, I'm sure.
What he called experiments of living.
Yes.
Right. Experiments of living.
And that's a very recognizable modern liberal kind of conception, right?
Which for an incredibly buttoned down guy with pointy hair and absolutely no peccadillos that anyone can identify is quite extraordinary. I mean, he really lived the opposite of that sex, drugs, and rock and roll philosophy.
Well, I think maybe he was still trying to get back at Daddy for his education. He was famously driven like a slave as a child by his father, James Mill.
Yeah, and we're getting way into the weeds here, right. But John Stuart Mill was. Let's back up first and talk a little bit about the tradition from which John Stuart Mill developed.
And place him in his historical context a little.
Right. So John Locke, who was in his prime in the late 1600s, was really the main definer of liberalism and of liberty. And he wrote two treatises of government and letters considering toleration, which were really seminal to the founding of America. And I'm pointing here as if I were in America.
In spirit.
But in spirit, definitely. And he defined liberty as freedom from force. And he was very, very clear on that point. And he argued particularly, and I claim that his main argument for freedom is not in the two treatises, which is what everybody takes as his definition of the proper government, and it is, but his core defense comes in, I think, in the letters concerning toleration, in which he argues that force cannot persuade a mind. And he's talking specifically in those letters about religious liberty, but the same arguments then get kind of assumed in his two treatises of government, but the arguments are presented in the letters concerning toleration. So in both works, he argues that the point of government is to protect individuals from force, or what he calls indemnification in property, which is just a fancy word for force or fraud, basically. And he argued for both economic liberty in the form of property rights and intellectual freedom. He was focused on religious liberty, but the same arguments apply to all intellectual freedom. So Locke had presented this argument that then just got accepted and really swept, particularly in the American world, but also eventually in the British world, became the defining philosophy of what became known as liberalism. Mm-hmm. Now, John Stuart Mill came around in 1904. That was when he was born, anyway. And he came around
1804.
1804, sorry.
That's okay. Just don't want to confuse anybody.
Yeah. 1804. And so he lived in the 19th century, which is what I was thinking of. And he was born of a father, James Mill, who was a philosophical radical in his own definition. And he was an economist, a philosopher, and a writer. And James Mill was a radical for freedom of all kinds, very much in the Lockean mode. And James Mill, along with Jeremy Bentham, who was his very close friend, decided to create John Stuart Mill as a kind of experiment in utilitarian education. So by the age of 3, he began being instructed in Greek and Latin. By the age of 5, I think he was getting French. Mm-hmm. At age 9, he began helping with the production of Ricardo's economic theories and editing the book, which later got published as, I believe, Principles of Economics. He then later wrote his own Principles of Economics book. By age, I think, 19, he had a mental breakdown.
Yeah.
Not unpredictably. And I think, but I think that development really explains a lot about his philosophical development. As far as his contribution to the idea of liberty, or contribution in a negative sense, I argue, he defined certain non-coercive actions, which he regarded as also violations of liberty, what he called the moral coercion of public opinion. And it's kind of smuggled in, it's buried in parentheticals but in the core paragraphs of the book. So it's clearly intended to appeal to the Lockean liberal,
right,
but to have this kind of poison pill built in. And what he argued, he borrowed the concept from Tocqueville of the tyranny of the majority, which former liberals, including Tocqueville, had regarded as the potential of the majority to hijack democratic or representative government and to then tyrannize the minority. But Mill said that there was an equivalent and even more pernicious form of tyranny of the majority, which he called the moral coercion of public opinion.
Right.
And his real point in that book, he, along with his wife, Harriet Taylor, who was almost a co-author of his theory on liberty, their point was to introduce this concept of moral coercion as being tantamount to and equally political to real coercion.
Well, I think we're already getting a sense for how this connects into what's happening today, where any form of disapproval or hate, quote unquote hate, etc., is regarded as equivalent to coercion, equivalent to force or violence, where speech can be violence.
That's right. That's exactly right. And Mill's whole point was that, as he put it, opinion is as efficacious as law. So he said that you might as well be imprisoned as excluded from the means of earning your bread. So, for example, let's say you're a gay person in, let's say, not today's world where it's increasingly accepted, but let's go back to let's say, 1990s. Very seldom were there persecutions or prosecutions of gay people, but you could still lose your job if your employer found out you were gay. You could still be denied housing and so on. You weren't granted, equal rights protection and so on. And so Mill would say that that person is just as subject to tyranny of the majority as the person who's put in prison for their unconventional behavior or whatever. And that, I think, is the key move in liberalism.
Now, what are the consequences? How does that unfold? Because, but at Mill's time, liberalism would still be much more recognizable as a pro-freedom movement at Mill's time and shortly afterwards. But then over time, those premises sort of work themselves out. So what's the process by which that happens?
That's right. And I think what this does is it really turns liberalism on its head. First of all, it eliminates an absolutely crucial distinction between ethics and politics. In the past, the famous line, which I'm told is apocryphal, from Moliere, I disagree vehemently with your opinion, but I would fight to the death for your right to express it. Well, that depends on a notion that there's a bright, shining line between what I disapprove of ethically and what the state should be involved in or what the government should be involved in. This completely dissolves that line. So there's no longer, after Mill, if you accept his poison pill into the liberal ideal, there is no longer an idea that there's a distinction. So now what that means is an increasing expansion of the role of the government. And first of all, we're immediately going to have to see capitalism as an engine of repression rather than as an expression of freedom, because capitalism means the economic system of freedom based on property rights. Well, if I'm a landowner and you want to rent an apartment from me or a house from me, and I have the right to my own property, then I get to be discriminatory under capitalism. If I have biases, bigotry, if I have bad ideas. And let me say, I am totally pro-gay, and I myself would be very happy to rent to a gay person. But let's say I were not. I have that right under capitalism. Well, now that gets defined as a violation of your liberty. Not you personally, but of the gay person's liberty. Right?
Right. And now, as I understand this too, Mill also is sort of responsible for drawing this line between property rights and human, quote unquote, human rights. You know, this is a standard of 20th century liberalism. There's property rights and there's human rights, and we're not going to respect the first, but we're going to respect the second.
Absolutely. And that's another key sort of idea that he injected into the liberal notion. And I think that the origin of that comes from exactly what I've been talking about, because property then becomes the source not of protecting your freedom, but of violating it. Property becomes the means by which I, as a landowner or as a business owner, can then discriminate against you, which violates your freedom, and therefore my exercise of my property rights must be subjected to the oversight of government to make sure that I'm not exercising it in a way that violates your, quote, social freedom. Mm-hmm. So that idea comes straight out of this notion. And Mill himself never really went down this road very far in terms of his explicit prescriptions for government. He gave some ideas. For example, he wanted establishment of an intellectual elite class, explicitly modeled on the Church of England, which he thought was, he didn't like the church itself. He was an atheist, but or to the extent he was confident about anything.
Yeah.
But he was deeply uncertain about all of life. But he wanted to have a kind of establishment that would pay for intellectuals on the grounds that the open free market would not properly fund their activities. Later, of course, that became in the U.S. context, the NEH and all the various alphabet endowments of financing arts and education and so on. And that's, of course, a whole huge topic worth discussing another time, with all kinds of problems inherent in it.
Well, I think it's fascinating, though, that he actually deliberately modeled it on the church. I mean, this is something we say a lot these days, which is it's become almost like a new priestly class. And it's interesting that from the beginning, that was the plan.
Absolutely. At least in Mill's mind, is very, very explicitly laid out. And of course, he's very clear that he doesn't want the church, but he wants an equivalent sort of approach. Right. He also, I think his ideas led directly to all of the anti-discrimination laws, the EEOC, and the various alphabet agencies that now oversee all hiring and firing decisions, and Title IX and other problematic interventions into the education field, all come straight out of this idea.
Well, and I think even beyond that, one of the examples I had in mind as the sort of collapse of liberalism, because the traditional 20th century liberalism was you're going to be free to say whatever you want, but we're going to have controls on economics. But the example that stuck in my mind, this is from about maybe a year and a half ago, there were a bunch of leftist protesters shouting down a speaker at, I think it's the College of William and Mary in Virginia. And the speaker was, who do you think it was? Some radical right-winger, a white nationalist? No, it was somebody from the ACLU of Virginia. So, the idea of leftist protesters shouting down someone from the ACLU kind of sums up where we're at, where this idea that your speech is coercion of me has become so thoroughly accepted that the ACLU arguing for people's right to speech becomes, tantamount to being a white nationalist.
Absolutely. And the ACLU itself is still reeling from this whole issue because, in some ways I like the ACLU and some of the things they've done, but sorry guys, you brought it on yourselves in a lot of ways,
Right.
because they accepted that definition of liberty that they got from John Stuart Mill, and now it's coming back to get them. And things like, card-carrying leftist professors being fired or put on academic suspension, administrative suspension for the crime of suggesting that Halloween costumes are not offensive. It's just, it's absolutely run amok now. And I have to say, as an instructor at a Chinese university for many years, I felt far less repression than my colleagues in the United States reported regularly. And I could relatively say anything I wanted to as long as I didn't directly critique the Communist Party. That, by the way, has changed, which we'll talk about another time.
Yeah.
But the U.S. now has out-Mao'd China.
And that is, and one of the things I've also noticed is that's gone over now into the into social media and into some of the things that Google and that Twitter and Facebook and things like that, some of the things that they're doing in terms of getting rid of some people. You can get your account suspended for saying something that they deem offensive.
Right.
That also has some parallels. Again, we're going to do another session on China, and we'll talk about the social credit score. But I think
Absolutely,
it's in a way
yes.
They're sort of pioneering that.
We're getting the social credit score in the U.S. now, yes.
Yeah.
And I have, of course, Google can do whatever it wants to do. Facebook can do whatever it wants to do. They're private companies. Hint to Congress, they're private companies. And again, I would go back to that old standard from John Locke, which is coercion. If someone comes on, if I ran Facebook, heaven forbid, if somebody came on Facebook and advocated coercion, he'd be off.
Right.
If they advocate racism, then they're not getting invited to my Christmas party.
Yeah.
But that is a moral choice. It's not coercion.
Right.
So, and I think that's, again, the bright line that liberalism should be upholding.
Yeah.
And in this sense, sorry to,
No, it's fine.
I'm orating now, I'm on my soapbox, but you started by talking about conservatism, and I think there's a sense in which, famously it was said by a congressman in the 60s, we're all liberals now. Mm-hmm. And there is a sense in which that's true, because American conservatism is a funny thing. Because the conservatism per se is conserving traditions, right? That's the definition. That's why it's called conservatism. Well, in the U.S., the traditions are liberal traditions,
right?
Lockean liberal traditions. So it's a little funny, and conservatism per se in the U.S. is actually, in some ways, in its best sense, it's really the true liberalism in the U.S., which is why the words get all mucked up, and it's very hard to even talk about coherently.
Well, it should be liberalism. Conservatism should be liberalism. I think right now it's a little bit more, things were, America was much better when Donald Trump was a kid, so we should go back to that. In another conversation,
I was trying to avoid getting into the Trump issue, but yes, unfortunately, it has become a different kind of conservatism, in my view.
Well, I had a discussion with trade recently, where I suggested that you can understand the current vogue on the right against free trade. You can understand that by listening to Bruce Springsteen songs. Because they're all about how much better life was for a blue-collar guy back when he was a kid. And that's
absolutely
kind of the sense of life there.
And I remember when that was what conservatives didn't like.
Right.
So that shows how old I am.
Now, let's go to the issue, though, of talking about trade and free markets and all that. So John Stuart Mill, now, I'm a little unclear on this in terms of my understanding of the history, but, he grew up, working on Ricardo's book. He grew up with his father being one of the, great free market classical economists. So my impression is that liberalism in his age was still the pro-free market, the pro-free trade party, and that he was more pro-free markets and pro-trade, even though he was starting to break down the issue of property rights as absolute. So how is it that developed to the point where property rights became, where they became not, and I'm not just talking about anti-discrimination laws, because in and of themselves, that's a fairly small thing. But how is it that they became the anti-capitalists?
Yeah, and I think that Mill is quite interesting in this regard, because he wrote a book in 1848, The Principles of Political Economy, a giant honking volume. And it was, at the time, and it is a truly great book on economics. It's one of the best, in my opinion. Then he reissued it in the 1850s after he had had some change of opinion, and he added some what are now known as the chapters on socialism. And now in the original book, it was a resounding economic defense of capitalism. However, it was explicitly from the beginning and from very early in the volume a pragmatic defense of capitalism. So he regarded capitalism as the best system purely on economic grounds. So he really, in some ways, I don't think he originated that division between the moral case for capitalism and the purely economic case for capitalism. Then, so first of all, point one is he emphatically said that capitalism is not a moral system, that capitalism is not based on the case for freedom. It's based on purely pragmatic economic terms. So then when a Keynes comes along and gives a convenient rationalization for the moral theory that the left wanted in the first place, then it was very easy to sweep John Stuart Mill's economics out of the water.
Right. It's no longer the pragmatic utilitarian thing to do. We have Keynesian economics, which is going to be really pragmatic and really utilitarian.
Even though it's as easy to poke a hole in as a balloon, but yes.
And I understand that the things he said very strongly about economics being just a matter of pragmatism, he said something different about intellectual freedom, that was, basically violates the conscience, and is, he used moral language when talking about that. And I think that is really what establishes a lot of what you see in classical early 20th century liberalism.
Absolutely. And again, it comes back to that distinction between force and persuasion in my terms, because he wants to say that capitalism is really a means of oppression if it's used improperly, or it's potentially a means for oppression. Of course, that's where the anti-capitalist left took off from. Now, he himself later in the 1850s added those chapters on socialism. He never really went whole hog into socialism. He kind of dipped his toe into the water, and he made a truly execrable argument that we should experiment with socialism, because he said the laws of production and the laws of distribution are themselves differentiated. The laws of production he thought of as the equivalent of natural laws, like physics. The laws of distribution he thought of as social matters. And it is an absolutely abysmal argument, and it falls apart as soon as you start to push on it even a little bit. But it was his way of suggesting that maybe we should kind of tiptoe away from capitalism and give a try to socialism.
And this very much explains,
we're still trying it to this day.
And this very much explains the modern left's approach that, well, we can just take for granted all this wealth that we have and all this production, and assume that all the trillions of dollars are here, and then we could redistribute them any way we like, and that money is still going to be produced, that wealth is still going to be manufactured.
Right. The production is here, so if we put the tariffs on, it'll move to the United States rather than just shutting down.
Right.
I said I wouldn't do it, and I did. So.
No, you can get on a soapbox about free trade anytime you like on this show.
All right.
Scott Lincecum might sue you for illegal foreign competition, but Chinese pro-free trade arguments coming in here to compete with American pro-free trade arguments.
Yeah, no worries there. But yeah, it's absolutely, and again, it all comes from John Stuart Mill. So this is why I personally call him public enemy number one for true liberalism, because without anybody even noticing it, and that's the really awful thing, he didn't come in like Marx with a straightforward argument for the evils of capitalism. He didn't come in like Skinner with an argument for social determinism. He came in with this subtle, what people regarded as a mere matter of definitions, pure semantics. And who could care about such a small matter? And gosh, he's got a point that there is this bad thing. And as I mentioned in the gay case, for example, or in racial discrimination, he's not wrong on the ethics of it, but on to the political, he destroyed the whole thing.
And the idea of
breaking
down the barrier between the ethical and the political, that anything that's wrong suddenly becomes something that can be regulated.
Right. Got a problem? Call your senator. Right? It's absolutely, it all traces straight back to John Stuart Mill. And of course, there were lots of other figures involved, but he was really the one that created that whole cascade of what we regard as liberalism in the United States today.
And the thing is, I still have conservatives recommending to me John Stuart Mill's On Liberty as one of the philosophical foundations of freedom.
Absolutely. And if you want to get me on a screen on Facebook, quote On Liberty positively, and I'll be on your thread in a heartbeat, because he's got some sweet sounding rhetoric, as I mentioned, but it absolutely is the destruction of liberty.
Now, this is all in a paper that's coming out in a book. What's the name of the book again? Got to give a book plug for the book.
The book is called, I have it here, The Philosophy of Capitalism, Objectivism and Alternative Approaches. And my paper is called The Arc of Liberalism, Locke, Mill, and Rand. Okay. And I argued that Ayn Rand really completed what John Locke started. And it's a great book. I've read some of the other papers that are in it. And even if mine weren't in it, I would still recommend it.
Well, so that's a good way to end with what do you think are the big ideas that we need to sort of fix the problem created by Mill, fix the confusions created by Mill?
Yeah, I think the key notion is to reintroduce that distinction between force and persuasion, between the moral realm and the political realm. And absolutely, we must insist that force, and only force, is the ultimate mind destroyer. That whatever forms of inappropriate discrimination, bad, immoral, unethical behavior, it cannot ever rise to the point of coercion where government should be involved to prevent it. So inappropriate, unethical, bad actions are on one side. What government should be involved in is strictly the prevention of coercion.
Yeah. And I think it's like deeply ironic, when we talk about the campus mobs and political correctness and that sort of thing. It's deeply ironic that his complaint about the coercive power of social disapproval has, in a way, indirectly led, by the circuitous route, has led to a point where social disapproval is used all the time to get people fired from jobs and to get people deplatformed from Patreon or Facebook or wherever.
Right. And I have to say that John Stuart Mill himself, like Frankenstein, whose birthday was 200 years ago now, I think John Stuart Mill himself would be horrified by the current state of U.S. academic and other intellection in general, I would say. But he is entirely responsible for it.
He created the monster. All right, well, thanks for coming on to talk about this. My guest is Bob Garmong, author of this forthcoming paper on John Stuart Mill and his concept of liberty. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you for the opportunity to get on my soapbox about my personal public enemy number one.
That's what the show is all about, letting people get on their soapboxes. I'm Rob Tracinski. This is Salon of the Refused. You can find more ideas and analysis at the Tracinski Letter, www.tracinskiletter.com. Please follow our video channel on YouTube, follow our podcasts, and you can also support us at Patreon, patreon.com/Salon of the Refused. Thank you for listening.